The morning fog rolled across the hills of Florence like a gray blanket, muffling the sounds of the awakening city. In a modest stone house near the old walls, a man sat at his wooden desk, his quill moving steadily across parchment. The year was 1513, and Niccolo Machiavelli had been writing since before dawn. His face showed no emotion as he worked, though inside, his mind burned with the lessons he had learned through years of observing power, betrayal, and the rise and fall of princes. The knock on his door came exactly when he expected it. 3 sharp raps, pause, then 2 more. Machiavelli set down his quill without haste and walked to the door. He opened it to find Giovanni, a young apprentice from the Medici household, standing nervously in the morning mist. "Master Machiavelli," Giovanni said, his voice shaking slightly. "Lord Lorenzo wishes to see you immediately. He says it's urgent." Machiavelli studied the young man's face for a long moment. The boy's eyes darted left and right, sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning air, and his hands trembled as they held the official message. These were signs Machiavelli had learned to read like words on a page. Fear, desperation. Someone was testing him again. "Tell me, Giovanni," Machiavelli said, his voice calm and measured. "How long did you wait outside my door before knocking?" The question clearly surprised the apprentice. I don't understand, sir. I came directly from Lord Lorenzo's palace." "That wasn't what I asked." Machiavelli's tone remained unchanged, but something in his eyes made Giovanni step backward. "Perhaps a few minutes, sir, to gather my courage." "Courage?" Machiavelli raised one eyebrow. "To deliver a simple message." Giovanni's face reddened. "Lord Lorenzo was very angry when he sent me, sir. He said terrible things would happen if you didn't come immediately." Machiavelli nodded slowly, then closed the door without another word. Giovanni stood outside, confused and frightened, for several minutes before running back toward the city center. Inside his house, Machiavelli returned to his desk and continued writing. This was the first lesson he had learned in his years of political survival. Never show fear, never show urgency, and never give immediate answers to demands wrapped in threats. Those who rule through intimidation expect quick compliance. When they don't receive it, they reveal their true weakness. An hour later, another knock came. This time it was Marco, one of Lorenzo's senior advisors. Marco was older, more experienced, and had the careful manner of a man who had survived several changes of power in Florence. "Niccolo," Marco said when the door opened, "Lorenzo is becoming impatient. He sent young Giovanni with a message, but the boy returned saying you refused to see him." "The boy delivered his message," Machiavelli replied. "I heard it clearly." "Then why haven't you come?" "I wasn't aware that I had agreed to come." Marco studied Machiavelli's face, looking for signs of defiance or fear. He found neither. "Lorenzo has questions about your writings, about your book." "I have answers," Machiavelli said simply. "Then come and give them." "When I'm ready." The conversation continued for several more minutes, but Machiavelli never raised his voice, never showed anger or fear, and never committed to any immediate action. When Marco finally left, he carried back to Lorenzo a message that would frustrate the young Medici prince. "Machiavelli acknowledges your request and will consider it in due time." This was not the response Lorenzo had expected from a man who had once served as second chancellor of the Florentine Republic, but now lived in exile and relative poverty. Most men in Machiavelli's position would have rushed to answer any summons from the powerful Medici family. Their fear would have made them eager to please, desperate to regain favor. But Machiavelli understood something that most people never learned. True authority comes not from position or wealth, but from the ability to remain calm when others lose their composure. The person who can wait while others hurry, who can think while others react, and who can remain silent while others feel compelled to speak, that person holds real power, regardless of their official title. As the day progressed, more messengers arrived. Each brought increasingly urgent requests from Lorenzo. Each time, Machiavelli listened politely, showed no emotion, and gave no immediate answer. By evening, the entire Medici household was talking about the strange man who seemed unafraid of their master's anger. The truth was more complex. Machiavelli wasn't unafraid, he was terrified. He knew that Lorenzo could have him arrested, beaten, or even killed. The young Medici prince had the power to destroy him completely. But Machiavelli also knew that showing this fear would guarantee his destruction. So he channeled his terror into cold calculation, using his fear as fuel for the discipline that kept him motionless and silent. This discipline had taken him years to develop. As a young man working in the Florentine government, he had made the common mistake of trying to please everyone. He had rushed to answer questions, eager to show his knowledge and competence. He had worn his emotions on his face, allowing others to read his thoughts and manipulate his reactions. The results had been disastrous. Colleagues had used his eagerness against him, feeding him false information to watch him scramble. Superiors had tested his loyalty by making unreasonable demands, knowing he would comply rather than risk their displeasure. He had been seen as clever but weak, useful but not dangerous. Everything changed during the crisis of 1501, when French armies threatened Florence and the city's leaders panicked. While other officials ran from meeting to meeting, spreading rumors and making desperate proposals, Machiavelli had remained calm. He had listened more than he spoke, observed more than he acted, and waited for the right moment to present his ideas. When that moment came, his words carried weight precisely because he hadn't wasted them on empty chatter. His calm demeanor made others assume he possessed secret knowledge or hidden strength. His silence had made his eventual words seem profound rather than desperate. From that crisis, he had learned the three principles that would guide the rest of his life. Never show your true thoughts until you know the cost of revealing them. Never rush into action until you understand all the consequences. Never answer questions until you know why they're really being asked. These principles had served him well through years of diplomatic missions, political intrigue, and dangerous negotiations. He had faced down French generals, papal legates, and Cesare Borgia himself, one of the most feared men in Italy. In each case, his cold discipline had been his greatest weapon. Now facing Lorenzo de' Medici's summons, he was using that same discipline once again. But this time was different. This time, he wasn't representing the Republic of Florence or carrying out official duties. This time, he was a private citizen whom Lorenzo could crush without political consequences. The risk was enormous, but so was the potential reward. If he could establish the right relationship with Lorenzo from the beginning, one based on respect rather than fear, he might be able to influence the young prince's thinking. He might even be able to return to political life. But only if he played this perfectly. As night fell over Florence, Machiavelli lit a single candle and returned to his writing. He was working on a treatise about political power, drawing from his years of experience and observation. The work that would later be called The Prince was taking shape on his desk, word by careful word. In the manuscript, he wrote about the importance of being feared rather than loved, of being decisive rather than popular, and of understanding that political survival often required actions that ordinary morality would condemn. But beneath these harsh truths lay a deeper lesson, one he was demonstrating through his own behavior. True strength wasn't about using force or making threats. True strength was about understanding human nature so completely that you could predict how people would react, then positioning yourself to benefit from those reactions. It was about controlling yourself so thoroughly that others couldn't read your intentions or manipulate your emotions. As he wrote, Machiavelli thought about Lorenzo packing his palace rooms, frustrated and confused by the morning's events. The young prince was learning something about power that no amount of wealth or noble birth could teach him. He was learning that some people couldn't be intimidated, bribed, or easily controlled. More importantly, Lorenzo was beginning to wonder what kind of man could remain so calm in the face of Medici power. Was Machiavelli truly fearless? Did he have secret allies? Was he more dangerous than he appeared? These questions would work in Machiavelli's favor, but only if he continued to provide no easy answers. The moment he showed weakness, fear, or desperation, the game would be over. Lorenzo would categorize him as just another frightened subject and treat him accordingly. So Machiavelli continued his cold discipline, writing by candlelight while a powerful young prince waited for him to show proper submission. With each hour that passed without a response, Machiavelli's apparent authority grew stronger. He was demonstrating the central paradox of political power. Sometimes the way to gain influence is to act as if you already have it. The candle burned lower as Machiavelli wrote about the nature of fear and respect. Most people, he observed, confused the two emotions. They thought that being feared meant being hated, and that being respected meant being liked. But the reality was more nuanced. True fear came not from threats or violence, but from uncertainty. People feared what they couldn't predict or control. A ruler who was consistently cruel might be hated, but his actions were predictable. A ruler whose responses couldn't be anticipated was much more frightening. Similarly, respect had nothing to do with popularity. Respect came from demonstrated competence and unwavering principles. People might not like someone who remained firm in his convictions, but they would respect his consistency. Machiavelli was betting his life on these principles. By refusing to show fear or eagerness, he was creating uncertainty in Lorenzo's mind. By maintaining his dignity regardless of the consequences, he was demanding respect rather than begging for mercy. The strategy was dangerous because it required perfect execution. One moment of visible weakness, one word spoken in haste, one gesture that revealed his true vulnerability, and the entire performance would collapse. Lorenzo would see through the facade and respond accordingly. But Machiavelli had spent years preparing for moments like this. Every diplomatic negotiation, every political crisis, every dangerous conversation had been training for the ultimate test of his principles. Now, in his modest house with his simple candle and his careful words, he was putting everything he had learned to the final test. Outside, Florence slept under the stars. In the Medici palace, Lorenzo lay awake wondering why a powerless exile could seem so unimpressed by his authority. And in his small room, Machiavelli continued writing about the cold discipline that builds absolute authority, living the lessons even as he recorded them for future generations to study. The night was far from over, and the real test was yet to come. Dawn broke over Florence with the sound of church bells echoing across red-tiled roofs. Machiavelli had not slept. He had spent the entire night writing, his hand moving steadily across page after page. When the first rays of sunlight streamed through his window, he set down his quill and walked to the small mirror hanging on his wall. The face that looked back at him showed no signs of the sleepless night. His eyes were clear, his expression calm, his posture straight. This, too, was part of his discipline. He had learned long ago that showing fatigue was showing weakness. No matter how exhausted he might feel inside, his exterior must project strength and control. He washed his face with cold water, dressed in his best clothes, and ate a simple breakfast of bread and wine. Every action was deliberate and unhurried. If Lorenzo's men were watching his house, and they probably were, they would see a man who appeared to have no concerns about the powerful enemies he might have made. The morning brought new visitors, but these were different from the previous day's messengers. Francesco Vettori, one of Machiavelli's oldest friends and a man with connections to the Medici family, arrived shortly after sunrise. Unlike the nervous servants and frustrated advisors who had come before, Francesco entered with the easy confidence of someone who understood both sides of this strange game. "Niccolo," Francesco said, settling into the room's single wooden chair, "you've certainly caused quite a stir in the city." Machiavelli poured wine for both of them, his movements deliberate and graceful. "Have I? I've done nothing but write and read as usual." Lorenzo spent most of yesterday asking everyone he could find about you. He wanted to know about your background, your connections, your weaknesses. He's trying to understand what kind of man ignores a direct summons from the Medici. "And what did people tell him?" Francesco smiled. "That's what makes this so interesting. The old servants remember you from your government days. They told stories about how you faced down Cesare Borgia without flinching, how you negotiated with kings and generals as if you were their equal. But they also mentioned that you've been living quietly for months, writing books and staying out of politics." "Both things are true." "Yes, but Lorenzo doesn't understand how both can be true. In his experience, men are either powerful or powerless, threatening or harmless. You seem to be something else entirely." Machiavelli sipped his wine and waited. Francesco was leading up to something, and rushing him would only interfere with whatever message he had come to deliver. "Lorenzo wants to meet with you today," Francesco continued. "But not in his palace with all his advisors and guards around. He wants to meet somewhere neutral, somewhere private. He's curious enough about you that he's willing to step down from his throne, so to speak." This was exactly what Machiavelli had hoped for, but he showed no excitement or relief. Instead, he asked a simple question: "Where?" "The old monastery garden behind Santa Croce. There's a small chapel there where scholars sometimes meet to discuss philosophy. Lorenz will come alone with just one guard waiting outside." Machiavelli considered this carefully. Meeting in a public place showed that Lorenzo was taking him seriously enough to treat him as an equal rather than a subject. But it also meant that Lorenzo was confident enough in his own safety to meet without heavy protection. This could be genuine curiosity, or it could be an elaborate trap. When Machiavelli asked, "This afternoon, an hour after the midday bells." "I'll consider it." Francesco laughed, but there was admiration in his voice. You know, most men would leap at the chance to meet privately with Lorenzo de' Medici. They'd see it as an opportunity to win his favor, to return to positions of influence. Most men make the mistake of appearing too eager, Machiavelli replied. They think enthusiasm shows loyalty, but it actually shows desperation. And you're not desperate. Machiavelli met his friend's eyes directly. Francesco, I've been out of power for months. I have no official position, no steady income, no protection from my enemies. Of course I'm desperate, but desperation is a private emotion. The moment I let others see it, it becomes a weapon they can use against me. So you hide your true feelings. I control my true feelings. There's a difference. Francesco finished his wine and stood to leave. Lorenzo is expecting an answer about the meeting. He'll have one when I'm ready to give it. After Francesco left, Machiavelli returned to his writing. But now he was working on a different project. He pulled out a fresh piece of parchment and began composing what looked like a formal letter. The writing was careful and elegant, the kind of document that would be preserved in official records. The letter was addressed to Lorenzo de' Medici, but its real audience was history itself. Machiavelli was creating a written record of his thoughts and principles, knowing that future scholars would study these documents to understand how political power really worked. In the letter, he wrote about the importance of maintaining dignity in all circumstances. He explained that true authority came not from the power to punish or reward others, but from the strength to remain true to one's principles regardless of external pressure. He described how fear and respect were different emotions, and how wise rulers learned to inspire respect rather than terror. But even as he wrote these high-minded thoughts, Machiavelli was engaged in a very practical calculation. Every word of the letter was chosen for its effect on Lorenzo. He was demonstrating his intelligence and education while also showing that he took their potential relationship seriously enough to commit his thoughts to writing. The letter served another purpose as well. By writing down his principles, Machiavelli was making it harder for himself to compromise them later. If he had private thoughts about backing down or showing weakness, putting his philosophy in writing created a barrier against such temptations. As the morning progressed, more visitors arrived at Machiavelli's house. Word had spread through Florence about the strange man who seemed unimpressed by Medici power. Some came out of curiosity, others to offer advice or warnings. A few were clearly spies sent by Lorenzo to gather more information. To each visitor, Machiavelli showed the same calm courtesy. He listened to their words, answered their questions thoughtfully, and revealed nothing of his internal calculations. Those who came expecting to find either a frightened exile or a dangerous rebel left confused by his ordinary dignity. One visitor was particularly interesting. Cardinal Alessandro Farnese, who was passing through Florence on church business, had heard about the situation and decided to investigate for himself. The cardinal was a sophisticated man who understood political maneuvering at the highest levels. "Master Machiavelli," the cardinal said, "I knew your reputation during your time in government. You handled some very delicate negotiations for the Republic." "I tried to serve Florence faithfully," Machiavelli replied. "And now you find yourself in an interesting position with the current rulers." Machiavelli poured wine for the cardinal but said nothing. "May I offer some advice?" the cardinal continued. "Young Lorenzo is intelligent but inexperienced. He has inherited great power, but he hasn't yet learned how to use it wisely. Men like you with experience in government could be valuable allies for him, if he chooses to seek such allies. Indeed, but such alliances require mutual respect. You cannot command respect through force, nor can you win it through submission." The cardinal's words showed that he understood exactly what game Machiavelli was playing. More importantly, his presence suggested that powerful people beyond Florence were watching this situation unfold. How Machiavelli handled Lorenzo might affect his reputation throughout Italy. After the cardinal left, Machiavelli made his decision about the afternoon meeting. He would go, but on his own terms. He finished the letter he had been writing, sealed it carefully, and prepared for what might be the most important conversation of his life. The walk to Santa Croce took him through the heart of Florence. He moved at his usual pace, neither hurrying nor dawdling. People who recognized him tried to catch his attention, but he acknowledged them with simple nods and continued on his way. He was performing his role perfectly, a man with important business who couldn't be distracted by casual social obligations. The monastery garden was quiet when he arrived. A few monks tended their vegetables in the distance, and birds sang in the olive trees. The small chapel Francesco had mentioned stood at the far end of the garden, its stone walls weathered by centuries of sun and rain. Lorenzo was already waiting inside. The young Medici prince sat on a simple wooden bench, dressed in fine clothes but without the elaborate decoration he usually wore in public. A single guard stood outside the chapel, far enough away that their conversation would be private. This was Machiavelli's first real look at Lorenzo in person. The young man was perhaps 25 years old, with a kind of handsome, intelligent face that suggested both privilege and capability. But there was something in his eyes that revealed his inexperience, a mixture of confidence and uncertainty that showed he was still learning how to carry his enormous inherited power. "Master Machiavelli," Lorenzo said, rising as he entered, "thank you for coming." "Your Magnificence," Machiavelli replied with a respectful bow that was correct but not servile. They sat facing each other on simple wooden benches, with afternoon sunlight streaming through the chapel's small windows. For a moment, neither spoke. Lorenzo was clearly waiting for Machiavelli to begin with some expression of gratitude or acknowledgement of his inferior position. Machiavelli remained silent, forcing the young prince to take the initiative. "I've been hearing interesting things about you," Lorenzo finally said. "People enjoy talking," Machiavelli replied neutrally. "They say you once stared down Cesare Borgia in a private meeting, that you negotiated with French generals as if Florence were equal to France, that you've survived political changes that destroyed other men. I've tried to serve my city honorably." Lorenzo leaned forward slightly. "They also say you're writing a book about political power, about how rulers can maintain control and authority." "I write about many things. May I ask what conclusions you've reached?" This was the moment Machiavelli had been preparing for. Lorenzo was asking him to share his wisdom, to position himself as a teacher or advisor. But he was also testing him, trying to see if Machiavelli would be eager to show off his knowledge or curry favor by giving advice. Machiavelli took his time answering. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful and measured. "I've learned that true authority cannot be given or taken away by others. It must be earned through consistent behavior and maintained through constant discipline." "What kind of discipline?" "The discipline of never showing more than you intend to reveal. The discipline of never acting from emotion when logic is available. The discipline of never speaking when silence would be more powerful." Lorenzo considered these words carefully. "And you believe these principles apply to all men, regardless of their position?" "I believe they apply especially to men in positions of power. A common citizen who loses his composure may embarrass himself. A ruler who loses his composure may destroy his state." They talked for over an hour, moving carefully through topics of statecraft, human nature, and the challenges of leadership. Lorenzo asked intelligent questions, and Machiavelli gave thoughtful answers. Neither man revealed more than he intended, but both began to understand what the other had to offer. As the conversation concluded, Lorenzo made an unexpected request. "I would like to read your book when it's finished," he said, "and I would like to meet with you again to discuss your ideas further." "If your Magnificence wishes," Machiavelli replied. "I do, but I have one condition. Our future meetings must be private like this one. I don't want my advisors or courtiers to know about our discussions, at least not yet." This request revealed several things. Lorenzo was smart enough to recognize value when he saw it, but he was also concerned about how it might appear to others if he was seen consulting with a former enemy of his family. The secrecy would protect both of them while they explored whether a genuine alliance was possible. "That's acceptable," Machiavelli said. As they prepared to leave the chapel, Lorenzo asked one final question. Yesterday, when my messengers came to summon you, why didn't you come immediately? Most men would have rushed to answer my call. Machiavelli paused at the chapel door and looked back at the young prince. Because, your magnificence, men who rush to answer summons are always seen as servants. I wanted our first meeting to be between equals. Lorenzo smiled, the first genuinely warm expression Machiavelli had seen from him. And was it? I believe so. As Machiavelli walked home through the afternoon streets of Florence, he reflected on what had just occurred. The meeting had gone better than he had hoped, but it was only the beginning. He had established the foundation for a relationship based on mutual respect rather than fear or favor. But maintaining that relationship would require the same cold discipline he had used to create it. The real work was just beginning. 3 weeks passed after the meeting in the monastery garden. During this time, Machiavelli maintained his routine with religious precision. He woke before dawn, wrote for several hours, received visitors in the afternoon, and spent his evenings walking through Florence's quiet streets. To anyone watching, he appeared to be living the simple life of a scholar with no particular concerns about politics or power. But beneath this calm surface, Machiavelli was conducting one of the most delicate operations of his career. Lorenzo had sent him private messages twice, each time requesting another meeting. Each time, Machiavelli had responded with polite delays. He was not ready, he explained. He needed more time to develop his thoughts, perhaps in another week or two. This was not procrastination or fear. It was strategy. Machiavelli understood that the person who controls the timing of meetings controls their outcome. By making Lorenzo wait, he was establishing that their relationship would develop according to his schedule, not the prince's demands. More importantly, he was creating anticipation and curiosity that would make Lorenzo more receptive to his ideas when they finally did meet again. During these 3 weeks, Machiavelli also received other visitors who tested his resolve in different ways. Some came bearing gifts from Lorenzo, books, wine, even offers of employment. Others brought threats disguised as friendly warnings about the dangers of seeming too independent. A few arrived with information about Lorenzo's other activities, clearly hoping to trade gossip for influence. To each of these approaches, Machiavelli responded with the same cold discipline. He accepted gifts graciously, but made no promises in return. He listened to threats calmly and gave no sign of being intimidated. He received information politely, but shared none of his own thoughts or observations. The most challenging visitor during this period was Lorenzo's chief advisor, a man named Filippo Strozzi. Strozzi was older and more experienced than Lorenzo, with decades of experience in Florentine politics. He had served the Medici family loyally for years and had earned their trust through careful service and absolute discretion. Strozzi arrived at Machiavelli's house on a rainy afternoon, accompanied by 2 guards who waited outside while he conducted his business. Unlike the previous messengers and advisors, Strozzi entered with the quiet confidence of a man who was accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Master Machiavelli," Strozzi said, settling himself comfortably in the room's best chair without waiting for an invitation. "We need to have a conversation." Machiavelli poured wine for both of them and waited. Strozzi's opening was clearly designed to establish his authority and put Machiavelli on the defensive. By claiming they needed to talk, he was implying that Machiavelli had obligations that required immediate attention. "Lord Lorenzo has developed an interest in your counsel," Strozzi continued. "This presents certain opportunities, but also certain dangers." "What kind of dangers?" Machiavelli asked. "The danger of misunderstanding your proper place in our household. Lorenzo is young and sometimes too eager to hear new ideas. He may not always recognize the difference between entertaining conversation and serious political advice." Strozzi paused to sip his wine, watching Machiavelli's face for signs of reaction. When he saw none, he continued with a slightly sharper tone. "You were an enemy of our family not so long ago. You served a government that opposed Medici interests. Some people might wonder whether your current friendship with Lorenzo represents genuine conversion or merely convenient adaptation." This was a direct challenge, the kind that demanded either submission or confrontation. Strozzi was testing whether Machiavelli could be intimidated into accepting a subordinate role or whether he would need to be dealt with more harshly. Machiavelli set down his wine cup and looked directly into Strozzi's eyes. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but perfectly clear. Master Strozzi, I have never been an enemy of the Medici family. I was a servant of the Florentine Republic, which had different interests at different times. Now that the Republic has ended, I serve Florence in whatever way I can. And you believe advising Lorenzo is service to Florence. I believe sharing knowledge and experience with any leader of Florence serves our city's interests. Strozzi leaned forward, his manner becoming more aggressive. Knowledge and experience are valuable, certainly, but they must be offered by men who understand their proper position. Lorenzo is not your equal, Machiavelli. He is your superior in every way that matters. Wealth, birth, power, influence, in all these things you are nothing compared to him. This was the moment Machiavelli had been expecting. Strozzi was trying to force him to acknowledge his inferior status, to accept the role of a grateful client receiving charity from a generous patron. If Machiavelli agreed, he would be trapped in a subordinate position forever. If he disagreed too strongly, he would be marked as dangerously prideful and eliminated accordingly. Instead, Machiavelli did something unexpected. He smiled. "Master Strozzi," he said, "you're absolutely correct. Lorenzo is superior to me in wealth, birth, power, and influence. I would never claim otherwise." Strozzi looked surprised by this easy agreement, but he pressed forward. "Then you understand that your role must be that of a humble advisor, grateful for whatever attention he chooses to give you. I understand that my value to Lorenzo lies not in competing with his advantages, but in offering him something he cannot get elsewhere." "And what might that be?" "The perspective of a man who has nothing left to lose." Strozzi frowned, clearly not understanding what Machiavelli meant. "You see," Machiavelli continued, "Lorenzo is surrounded by men like yourself, intelligent, capable men who have built their careers on serving the Medici family faithfully. Such men are invaluable, but they all share one limitation. They cannot afford to give advice that might displease their master because their positions depend on his continued favor. Are you suggesting we tell Lorenzo what he wants to hear rather than what he needs to hear? I'm suggesting that men with much to lose naturally become cautious about offering uncomfortable truths. I, having already lost everything, can afford to be completely honest. And you think Lorenzo values such honesty? I think any intelligent ruler values accurate information more than flattering lies, but perhaps you know him better than I do." This exchange continued for another hour, with Strozzi trying various approaches to establish Machiavelli's proper subordination and Machiavelli deflecting each attempt with calm logic. By the time Strozzi left, he had learned something important. Machiavelli could not be intimidated, bribed, or easily categorized. This made him either very valuable or very dangerous, possibly both. 2 days after Strozzi's visit, Machiavelli received a message that changed everything. Lorenzo was facing a crisis and needed advice immediately. A group of Florentine nobles had approached him with a proposal that could either strengthen his position significantly or destroy him completely. The message asked Machiavelli to come to the Medici palace that evening for an emergency consultation. This was exactly the kind of urgent summons that Machiavelli had been refusing for weeks, but the circumstances were different now. Lorenzo wasn't demanding his presence out of pride or curiosity. He was requesting help with a real problem. More importantly, he was trusting Machiavelli with sensitive information that could be used against him if it fell into the wrong hands. Machiavelli made his decision quickly. He would go, but he would set the terms of the meeting. He sent a reply stating that he would be happy to help Lorenzo think through this difficult situation, but that such conversations required absolute privacy. He suggested they meet in Lorenzo's private study, with no advisors or servants present. The evening meeting took place in a small room at the top of the Medici palace. The walls were lined with books and maps, and a single oil lamp provided flickering light. Lorenzo was waiting when Machiavelli arrived, packing nervously around the room. "Thank you for coming," Lorenzo said immediately. "I know you prefer more time to consider such requests." "Some situations require immediate attention," Machiavelli replied. "What's troubling you?" Lorenzo described the proposal he had received. A group of wealthy Florentine merchants, led by a man named Roberto Pazzi, had offered to provide substantial financial support for Lorenzo's government. In exchange, they wanted him to grant them exclusive trading rights with certain foreign cities and protection from their business competitors. On the surface, this seemed like a beneficial arrangement. The Medici government needed money, and the merchants were offering it in exchange for legitimate business advantages. But Lorenzo sensed there might be hidden dangers in the proposal. "What concerns you about their offer?" Machiavelli asked. "Several things. First, the amount of money they're offering is almost too generous. Second, Roberto Pazzi has been critical of my family in the past. Third, the timing seems suspicious. They approached me just days after my advisors mentioned that our treasury was running low." Machiavelli listened carefully, asking occasional questions to clarify details. As Lorenzo spoke, a clearer picture emerged. The merchants weren't just offering money, they were positioning themselves to gain significant control over Florence's economy. If Lorenzo accepted their terms, he would become dependent on their continued support. If he later tried to break free from that dependence, they could threaten to withdraw their funding and crash the government's finances. "This is not a business proposal," Machiavelli said finally. "It's a trap." "What do you mean?" "They're offering you enough rope to hang yourself. If you accept their money and use it to fund government operations, you'll be unable to reject their future demands without risking financial collapse. They're essentially buying control of your government for the price of a temporary loan." Lorenzo stopped packing and stared at him. "But we do need the money. Our expenses are greater than our income, and that situation won't improve without outside help." "Then you need to find different help, or reduce your expenses, or increase your income through other means. What you cannot do is solve a financial problem by surrendering political independence." "Do you have specific suggestions?" This question put Machiavelli in a delicate position. Lorenzo was asking for detailed advice about government policy, the kind of counsel that would make him a true advisor rather than just an occasional consultant. If he provided such advice and it worked well, he would gain significant influence. If it failed, he would be blamed for the consequences. But this was also an opportunity to demonstrate the value of his perspective. If he could help Lorenzo navigate this crisis successfully, their relationship would be established on a foundation of proven competence rather than theoretical knowledge. "I have several suggestions," Machiavelli said. "But first, let me ask you a question. How much do your current advisors know about this proposal?" "I discussed it with them yesterday. They were divided. Some thought it was an excellent opportunity, others were more cautious." "And what did Filippo Strozzi recommend?" "He said we should accept the offer but negotiate better terms." Machiavelli nodded. This confirmed his suspicion that Strozzi, despite his intelligence and experience, was thinking like a courtier rather than a strategist. He was focused on the immediate financial benefit rather than the long-term political implications. "My first suggestion," Machiavelli said, "is that you tell no one else about this conversation. If people know you're receiving private counsel from me, they'll either try to influence what I tell you or work to discredit my advice." "Agreed. What else?" "Second, you should reject the merchant's proposal, but not immediately. Take several days to consider it, ask for additional details, and suggest modifications to their terms. This will buy you time to explore alternative solutions." "And those alternatives?" Machiavelli pulled out a piece of parchment and began sketching a rough map of northern Italy. As he drew, he explained his thinking. "Florence's financial problems stem from reduced trade revenues and increased military expenses. Instead of borrowing money to cover these costs, you need to address their underlying causes." He pointed to several cities on his map. "These are all places where Florentine merchants face unfair competition from local traders who have political protection. If you could negotiate new trade agreements with these cities, Florence's revenues would increase significantly. But such negotiations would take months, and we need money now. Which brings me to my third suggestion. You have assets that you're not using effectively." Over the next 2 hours, Machiavelli outlined a comprehensive strategy for solving Lorenzo's financial crisis without surrendering political independence. The plan involved diplomatic negotiations, administrative reforms, and strategic alliances that would increase government revenues while reducing unnecessary expenses. More importantly, the plan positioned Lorenzo as an active leader taking decisive action rather than a desperate borrower accepting whatever help he could find. If executed correctly, it would not only solve his immediate problems, but also strengthen his long-term authority. As the evening concluded, Lorenzo looked at the notes he had taken during their conversation. Pages of detailed suggestions, potential problems, and alternative approaches covered his desk. "This is exactly what I needed," he said. "Not just solutions to my immediate problems, but a way of thinking about such problems that I can use in the future." "That's the most valuable thing any advisor can offer," Machiavelli replied. "Not answers to specific questions, but better ways of asking the questions." Lorenzo walked him to the door, then paused. "Niccolo, I want you to know that this conversation has been more useful than months of meetings with my regular advisors. They tell me what they think I want to hear or what will serve their own interests. You've told me what I need to know. That's because I have nothing to gain by telling you lies, and nothing to lose by telling you the truth." As Machiavelli walked home through the dark streets of Florence, he reflected on the evening's work. The crisis had provided an opportunity to demonstrate his value in concrete terms rather than abstract principles. Lorenz now understood that Machiavelli's counsel came without hidden agendas or personal ambitions. More importantly, Machiavelli had shown Lorenzo a different way of thinking about leadership. Instead of reacting to problems with desperate measures, Lorenzo could learn to anticipate difficulties and position himself to handle them from strength rather than weakness. The relationship between them was evolving from mutual curiosity to genuine partnership. But Machiavelli knew that maintaining this partnership would require the same cold discipline that had created it. One moment of overconfidence, one suggestion motivated by personal benefit rather than Lorenzo's interests, and the trust they had built would disappear forever. The real test of his principles was just beginning. The crisis came 6 months after that first emergency meeting in Lorenzo's study. By this time, Machiavelli had become Lorenzo's most trusted advisor, though their relationship remained carefully hidden from the rest of the Medici court. They met privately twice each week, always in different locations and always without witnesses. Lorenzo had implemented most of Machiavelli's suggestions about financial reform, and Florence's treasury was stronger than it had been in years. But success had created its own dangers. Other advisors had begun to notice that Lorenzo was making decisions without consulting them. Some suspected he was receiving counsel from hidden sources, and a few had started investigating to discover who might be influencing their young master. The most dangerous of these investigators was Filippo Strozzi. The veteran advisor had served the Medici family too long to be easily fooled, and he had resources throughout Florence that could uncover almost any secret given enough time. Machiavelli knew that Strozzi was closing in on the truth, but he also knew that panicking or changing his behavior would only confirm the man's suspicions. Instead, he maintained his usual routine while preparing for the inevitable confrontation. When it came, it arrived in the form of a carefully laid trap. The trap was sprung on a Tuesday morning in November. Machiavelli was sitting in his usual cafe near the Duomo, reading and writing as he did most mornings, when 3 men approached his table. One was Strozzi. The other 2 were armed guards wearing Medici colors. "Master Machiavelli," Strozzi said, sitting down uninvited, "what a pleasant surprise to find you here." Machiavelli looked up from his book and nodded politely. "Master Strozzi, good morning. I was just telling my companions here about our previous conversation at your house, about the proper relationship between advisors and their masters." "An interesting topic," Machiavelli replied, closing his book and giving Strozzi his full attention. "Indeed, and it occurs to me that we never finished that discussion. There were questions left unanswered." Strozzi was fishing, trying to draw Machiavelli into revealing something that would confirm his suspicions. The guards were there to provide intimidation and, if necessary, to arrest him on whatever charges Strozzi might invent. "What questions?" Machiavelli asked. "Questions about loyalty, about the proper channels for offering advice to important men, about the dangers of unauthorized influence." "All important considerations," Machiavelli agreed. "Yes, which is why I think you should come with me to discuss these matters more thoroughly." This was the moment Machiavelli had been preparing for. Strozzi was trying to force him into a private interrogation where threats and pressure could be applied without witnesses. If he went willingly, he would be admitting guilt. If he refused, the guards would arrest him anyway, but his resistance would be seen as evidence of wrongdoing. Instead, Machiavelli did something that surprised everyone present. He smiled and stood up as if delighted by the invitation. "What an excellent idea," he said. I would very much enjoy continuing our philosophical discussion, but surely such an important conversation deserves a proper setting. Strozzi looked suspicious. What kind of setting? Well, since you mentioned the proper relationship between advisors and their masters, perhaps we should have this discussion in the presence of the master himself. I'm sure Lorenz would be interested in hearing your thoughts on these matters. This suggestion put Strozzi in an impossible position. He couldn't refuse without seeming to avoid Lorenzo's oversight, but he also couldn't agree without revealing that his investigation was unauthorized. Lorenz knew nothing about Strozzi's suspicions regarding Machiavelli, and bringing the matter to Lorenzo's attention would force Strozzi to explain why he had been conducting secret investigations without permission. I don't think that's necessary, Strozzi said carefully. Oh, but I insist, Machiavelli replied. These questions of loyalty and proper channels are too important to discuss privately. They deserve the attention of the highest authority. Lord Lorenzo is busy with other matters. Then we should wait until he has time. I wouldn't want to rush such an important conversation. The standoff continued for several more minutes, with Strozzi trying to find a way to force Machiavelli into private custody and Machiavelli politely insisting that their discussion required Lorenzo's presence. Finally, frustrated and unable to proceed without revealing his unauthorized activities, Strozzi withdrew with his guards. But Machiavelli knew this was only a temporary victory. Strozzi would find another approach, probably more dangerous than direct confrontation. The time had come to bring the situation to Lorenzo's attention before his enemies could control the narrative. That afternoon, Machiavelli sent Lorenzo an urgent message requesting a meeting that evening. The message was brief and gave no details, but its tone suggested serious developments that required immediate attention. They met in the monastery garden where their first private conversation had taken place. Lorenz arrived looking concerned and slightly annoyed. He had been forced to cancel other appointments to make time for this unexpected meeting. This is highly irregular, Niccolo, Lorenzo said as they walked among the olive trees. Our usual meetings are planned days in advance. The circumstances are irregular, Machiavelli replied. We have a problem that requires immediate decision. He described the morning's encounter with Strozzi, explaining the advisor's suspicions and the investigation that had led to the attempted interrogation. As he spoke, Lorenzo's expression grew increasingly serious. Filippo has been asking me questions, Lorenzo said when Machiavelli finished. Nothing direct, but he's been trying to understand how I've been making certain decisions. I thought he was just curious about my reasoning. He's been investigating for months. He knows we've been meeting, but he doesn't yet have proof of what we discuss. What do you recommend? This question put Machiavelli in the most difficult position of his career. He could advise Lorenzo to distance himself from their relationship, protecting the young prince's reputation at the cost of his own safety. Or he could suggest that Lorenzo confront Strozzi directly, risking a dangerous power struggle within the Medici household. But there was a third option, one that required perfect execution and absolute trust between them. I recommend that you make our relationship public, Machiavelli said. Lorenzo stopped walking. What? Announce that you've been consulting with me on matters of state. Make it clear that this is your decision as ruler of Florence, not something that was hidden from you or done behind your back. That would cause tremendous controversy. Many people still see you as an enemy of our family. Exactly, which is why announcing our collaboration would be such a powerful demonstration of your authority. You would be showing that you're confident enough in your position to work with former enemies if it serves Florence's interests. Lorenzo considered this carefully as they walked. But what about Filippo and the other advisors? They'll see this as a challenge to their influence. They will, which will force them to choose between accepting your decision or challenging your authority openly. Either choice will clarify the power relationships in your government. And if they choose to challenge me, then you'll discover who can be trusted to support your decisions and who believes they have the right to overrule you. Better to know now than during a real crisis. They talked for another hour, examining the risks and benefits of making their relationship public. Machiavelli explained that secrecy had served its purpose by allowing them to establish trust and develop effective working methods. But continued secrecy would eventually become a liability, creating opportunities for enemies to use their hidden collaboration against them. More importantly, public acknowledgement would transform their relationship from a potential scandal into a demonstration of Lorenzo's political sophistication. Instead of seeming to rely on hidden advisors, he would be seen as a leader confident enough to seek counsel from the most capable people available, regardless of their past affiliations. Lorenzo made his decision that night. The next morning, he called a formal meeting of his entire advisory council. When all the traditional counselors were assembled in the palace's main conference room, he made an announcement that stunned them into silence. "Gentlemen," Lorenzo said, "I want to inform you that I have been consulting with Niccolo Machiavelli on various matters of state. This consultation has proven valuable to me and beneficial to Florence. I am therefore appointing Master Machiavelli as a special advisor to my government, with particular responsibility for diplomatic and strategic planning." The reaction was immediate and intense. Several advisors began speaking at once, some expressing outrage and others demanding explanations. Strozzi's face went white as he realized that his secret investigation had been rendered irrelevant by Lorenzo's public announcement. But Lorenzo maintained the same cold discipline that Machiavelli had taught him. He allowed the initial outburst of emotion, then called for silence and addressed each concern systematically. To those who questioned Machiavelli's loyalty, he pointed out that former enemies who become allies often make the most dedicated supporters, since they must prove themselves constantly. To those who worried about precedent, he explained that consulting with experts outside the traditional court structure was a sign of political maturity, not weakness. Most importantly, he made clear that this decision was final and not subject to debate or revision by his advisors. "I value your counsel on many matters," Lorenzo told them, "but the choice of who advises me is mine alone. If any of you feel uncomfortable serving alongside Master Machiavelli, I will accept your resignation with gratitude for your past service." No one resigned. They understood that Lorenzo was testing their loyalty and that failing the test would mean the end of their political careers. But Machiavelli knew that several of them would never accept his presence willingly and would work to undermine his influence whenever possible. The public announcement of Machiavelli's appointment created exactly the reaction Lorenzo had predicted. Supporters praised the young prince's political sophistication and willingness to put Florence's interests above personal grudges. Critics accused him of poor judgment and dangerous naivety. But both supporters and critics acknowledged that Lorenzo had made a bold decision and backed it with unwavering commitment. Whether they agreed with his choice or not, they could see that he was acting from strength rather than weakness. For Machiavelli, the appointment represented both vindication and danger. His principles of cold discipline had been proven correct. By maintaining his dignity and demonstrating his value, he had transformed himself from a powerless exile into an influential advisor. But his new position also made him a target for everyone who opposed Lorenzo's government or resented his own rise to prominence. The test of his character was no longer about gaining authority. Now it was about using that authority wisely and maintaining it against those who would try to destroy him. 3 days after the public announcement, Machiavelli received an unexpected visitor at his house. Cardinal Alessandro Farnese, who had spoken with him months earlier during his first conflict with Lorenzo, had returned to Florence and requested a private meeting. "Master Machiavelli," the cardinal said, "you have accomplished something remarkable. Most men who fall from power never recover their influence. You have not only recovered yours but enhanced it." "I've tried to serve Florence faithfully," Machiavelli replied. "Indeed, but I wonder if you understand the full implications of your new position." "What implications?" "You are now the most visible example in Italy of how intelligence and determination can overcome political disaster. Every ambitious man who has suffered setbacks will study your methods. Every ruler will want to understand how you rebuilt your career." The cardinal paused to sip his wine, watching Machiavelli's reaction. "This attention brings opportunities, but also dangers. You will receive offers from other courts, other princes who want to benefit from your counsel. You will also attract enemies who see your success as a threat to their own positions. And you believe this presents some particular challenge." "I believe it presents a choice. You can use your influence with Lorenzo to build something lasting for Florence, or you can use it as a stepping stone to greater personal advancement. But you cannot do both. The cardinal's warning was clear. Machiavelli's success had made him a figure of international interest, but it had also created temptations and pressures that could destroy everything he had built. The cold discipline that had brought him to power would need to evolve to help him maintain and use that power responsibly. As the cardinal left, Machiavelli reflected on how much his life had changed since that first morning when Lorenzo's messenger had knocked on his door. Then, he had been a man with nothing to lose who could afford to remain perfectly honest. Now, he was a man with everything to protect, and the temptations of power were beginning to test his principles in new ways. The real work was just beginning. 2 years had passed since Machiavelli's appointment as Lorenzo's special advisor. In that time, Florence had prospered under their combined leadership. The city's finances were stronger than they had been in decades, diplomatic relationships had improved significantly, and internal opposition to Lorenzo's rule had largely disappeared. But success had brought its own complications. Machiavelli's influence had grown far beyond what anyone had initially expected. Foreign ambassadors now sought meetings with him as eagerly as they pursued audiences with Lorenzo. His writings on political strategy were being copied and studied in courts throughout Europe. Offers arrived regularly from other rulers who wanted him to serve their interests. Through all of this attention and opportunity, Machiavelli maintained the same cold discipline that had first brought him to Lorenzo's notice. He accepted honors graciously, but made no public displays of personal ambition. He listened to offers from other courts respectfully, but gave no commitments. He continued to live simply, to dress modestly, and to treat both powerful visitors and common citizens with the same courteous dignity. But privately, he was facing the greatest challenge of his career. The principles that had guided his rise to influence were being tested by the complexities of actually exercising power. The test came in the form of a crisis that threatened everything Lorenzo had built. A coalition of rival Italian cities, led by Venice and secretly supported by France, had formed an alliance aimed at reducing Florence's growing influence. They were planning a coordinated attack that would combine military pressure with economic warfare, designed to force Lorenzo into a subordinate position within a larger confederation of states. Lorenzo learned of this threat through Machiavelli's intelligence network, which had grown sophisticated enough to gather information from across Europe. The warning came early enough to allow for preparation, but the situation was more dangerous than anything they had previously faced together. "How long do we have?" Lorenzo asked during an emergency meeting in his private study. "Perhaps 3 months before they're ready to move," Machiavelli replied. "Less if they decide to act before their preparations are complete." "What are our options?" This question forced Machiavelli to confront the fundamental contradiction in his position. As Lorenzo's advisor, his duty was to provide the best possible counsel for Florence's interests. But as a man who had spent years studying political power, he could see opportunities in this crisis that would serve his own advancement at the expense of others. The alliance threatening Florence was formidable, but it was also unstable. Venice and France had different long-term objectives, and their cooperation would likely collapse if the right pressures were applied at the right moments. Machiavelli could engineer that collapse, but doing so would require actions that many people would consider dishonorable. He could arrange for false information to reach the French court, information that would convince them that Venice was planning to betray their alliance. He could negotiate secret agreements with minor Italian cities that would provide military support in exchange for territorial concessions that Florence could afford. He could even arrange for certain Venetian merchants to suffer mysterious business losses that would pressure their government to reconsider its hostile policies. All of these strategies would probably work. The alliance against Florence would crumble, Lorenzo's position would be secured, and Machiavelli's reputation for political cunning would be enhanced. But each strategy required deception, manipulation, and the willingness to harm people who had done Florence no direct injury. "I need time to develop a comprehensive response," Machiavelli said. "This situation requires careful analysis." "How much time?" 3 days. Lorenzo agreed, and Machiavelli withdrew to his house to think through the most important decision of his career. He had always believed that political survival sometimes required actions that ordinary morality would condemn. But believing this in theory was different from implementing it in practice, especially when the consequences would affect thousands of innocent people. For 3 days, Machiavelli remained in complete isolation. He told his servants to admit no visitors and answer no messages. He ate little, slept less, and spent most of his time walking back and forth in his small garden, thinking through every aspect of the crisis and every possible response. By the end of the 3rd day, he had made his decision, but implementing that decision would require the most careful performance of his career. He returned to Lorenzo with a proposal that surprised everyone who heard it. Instead of recommending the cunning strategies that most people expected from him, Machiavelli suggested a course of action that was bold, direct, and completely honest. "We should call their bluff," he told Lorenzo and the assembled council of advisors. "What do you mean?" Strozzi asked. The veteran advisor had never fully accepted Machiavelli's presence, but he had learned to respect his strategic thinking. "I mean we should make their alliance public before they're ready to act. We should send ambassadors to every court in Europe, explaining exactly what Venice and France are planning and asking for support against unprovoked aggression." The room erupted in arguments. Several advisors pointed out that this approach would eliminate any chance of secret diplomacy or behind-the-scenes maneuvering. Others worried that public confrontation would force the alliance to attack immediately rather than waiting for ideal conditions. But Machiavelli had anticipated these objections. He spent the next hour explaining why direct confrontation would actually work better than subtle manipulation. "Venice and France have formed this alliance in secret because they know their cause is weak," he said. "They're trying to destroy Florence's independence for their own benefit, not because we've threatened them in any way. If their plans become public knowledge, they'll be seen throughout Europe as aggressors attacking a smaller state without justification." "But what if other courts support them anyway?" Lorenzo asked. "Then we'll know where we stand, and we can plan accordingly. But I believe most rulers will recognize that supporting unprovoked aggression creates a dangerous precedent. If Venice and France can destroy Florence simply because it has become prosperous and influential, what's to stop them from targeting other successful cities in the future?" Machiavelli's strategy was risky, but it had one enormous advantage. It was completely honest. Instead of trying to manipulate the situation through deception, he was proposing to win through moral clarity and logical argument. The plan worked exactly as he had predicted. When Florence's ambassadors arrived at courts throughout Europe with detailed evidence of the alliance's aggressive intentions, the reaction was immediate and favorable. Even rulers who had no particular fondness for Florence recognized that supporting unprovoked attacks on successful cities would create chaos throughout the diplomatic system. More importantly, the public exposure of their plans created exactly the kind of internal tensions within the alliance that Machiavelli had originally hoped to achieve through manipulation. Venice and France began blaming each other for security failures that had allowed their secret negotiations to become public knowledge. Their smaller allies started questioning whether association with such an unpopular cause was worth the risks. Within 6 weeks, the alliance had collapsed completely. Venice withdrew from the arrangement, claiming they had never intended to participate in actual warfare. France redirected its attention to other diplomatic priorities. The smaller Italian cities that had agreed to provide support quietly informed Florence that they no longer considered themselves bound by their previous commitments. Lorenzo's position was stronger than ever, and Florence's reputation throughout Europe was enhanced by the dignified way the crisis had been handled. But the most significant result was the effect on Machiavelli's own reputation and self-understanding. By choosing honest confrontation over cunning manipulation, he had discovered something important about the relationship between personal character and political effectiveness. The cold discipline that had brought him to power wasn't just about controlling his emotions or hiding his intentions. It was about maintaining his integrity even when expedient compromises would have been easier. "You could have destroyed that alliance in a dozen different ways," Lorenzo said during a private conversation after the crisis had passed. "Some of them would have been faster and probably more certain. Why did you choose the most difficult approach?" Machiavelli considered the question carefully before answering. because the other approaches would have required us to become the kind of people we were trying to protect Florence from. You mean dishonest? I mean willing to harm innocent people for political advantage. Venice and France were our enemies, but their merchants and citizens weren't. The minor cities that joined their alliance were making mistakes, but they weren't evil. If we had destroyed them through deception and manipulation, we would have created real injustices to prevent theoretical ones. Lorenzo nodded thoughtfully. So your famous advice about being feared rather than loved doesn't mean being cruel or dishonest. Not at all. It means being strong enough to make hard decisions when necessary, but wise enough to distinguish between what's necessary and what's merely convenient. This conversation marked a turning point in both men's understanding of political leadership. They had learned that true authority came not from the power to harm others, but from the strength to remain principled under pressure. Over the following months, Machiavelli completed the work that would later be called The Prince. But the book that emerged from his experience was different from what most people expected. Instead of being a manual for cunning manipulation, it became a study of how leaders could maintain their integrity while dealing with the harsh realities of political life. The central message of his book was the same lesson he had lived. True authority comes from consistent character, not clever tactics. A ruler who maintained his principles under pressure would inspire more respect and loyalty than one who changed his positions based on immediate advantages. But the book also acknowledged that maintaining such consistency required enormous personal discipline. Leaders would face constant temptations to compromise their values for short-term gains. They would be surrounded by advisors who urged expedient solutions to complex problems. They would be tested by enemies who had no scruples about using any methods necessary to achieve their goals. The only defense against these pressures was the kind of cold discipline Machiavelli had developed over years of political survival. The ability to remain true to one's principles regardless of external circumstances. As Machiavelli finished his book, he reflected on how much he had learned since that first morning when Lorenzo's messenger had knocked on his door. He had begun that journey as a man with nothing left to lose, using his desperate situation as a source of strength. He was ending it as a man with everything to protect, but he had learned that real security came not from accumulating power, but from using it responsibly. The cold discipline that had built his authority was the same discipline that now guided how he exercised that authority. He had learned to control not just his fears and ambitions, but his temptations and opportunities as well. Years later, when scholars studied Machiavelli's career and writings, they would debate whether he had been a teacher of virtue or a counselor of vice. But those who looked most carefully at his actual life would see that he had been something more complex and more admirable than either alternative. He had been a man who learned to remain human while wielding political power, and who taught others that such a combination was not only possible, but necessary for any government that hoped to serve its people rather than merely controlling them. The true legacy of his cold discipline was not the authority it helped him build, but the character it helped him maintain while exercising that authority. In a world where political power often corrupted even well-intentioned people, Machiavelli had demonstrated that it was possible to gain influence through integrity and to keep it through wisdom. His name would become associated with cunning and manipulation, but his life had actually proven the opposite, that the strongest foundation for lasting authority was uncompromising commitment to one's deepest principles, maintained through the kind of disciplined character that could remain steady under any pressure. This was the cold discipline that built absolute authority, not the power to control others, but the strength to control oneself.